Elizabeth Eaton Converse was born on August 3, 1924, in Laconia, New Hampshire. She came from an English family with roots in New England, where her father was a minister. Elizabeth was the middle child and only daughter of Ernest and Evelyn Converse. She was preceded by her older brother Paul, and when she was 5 years old, her younger brother Philip was born. Eventually, Elizabeth's father would direct his state chapter of the Anti-Saloon League, the group that wanted to keep prohibition alive. It's unknown what Mr. Converse did after the dissolution of the League in 1933 after the repeal of the 18th Amendment, which banned alcohol in America. Since 1940 census records stated he was unemployed, though interestingly enough, his wife was listed as an engineer for the railroad, so I do wonder if this is an error. Elizabeth was extremely successful in school, having had a poem in 7th grade published in her local paper. Philip has recalled memories of his sister fondly, such as when she painted a wall with the life-size portrait of Robin Hood in Sherwood Forest that was later used as a background for performances for her brothers. She later graduated as valedictorian from high school and later was awarded scholarships to go to college. Elizabeth went to the same college that her mother and grandmother went to, Mount Holyoke. Eventually, she dropped out and moved to New York City to pursue a music career. The change in her life upset her parents, who were described as heartbroken and assumed she was running away from them by her younger brother Philip. When Elizabeth moved to New York, she got a job at the Institute of Pacific Studies and found an apartment on Grove Street in Greenwich Village. Eventually, she started creating music after teaching herself guitar and made friends in the new city. Her friends started calling her Connie, and she wrote a plethora of poems. While making friends and living with a new crowd, Connie picked up smoking and drinking, which was something completely opposite from the values that her father, who was part of a prohibition group, raised them with. Eventually, she met Gene Deitch, a World War II veteran that would invite Connie over to record at his home. Sometimes she would record in front of her friends. Many of her songs were poems that she wrote, set to music. In 1954, Connie appeared on the CBS morning show with Walter Cronkite, though the appearance did not attract much attention. Her own parents did not even watch the show. In August of 1955 or 1956, Connie sent her brother Philip an album she created, Musics, Volumes 1 and 2. She left a message that read, "These reels are strewn with minor mishaps. On the other hand, they're not so bad. With love and modest pride, Elizabeth Converse, August 1956." While unknown when Ernest, her father, died, he passed, never hearing her music. Even though Connie tried very hard to get some sort of attention, her efforts yielded no contracts. In 1961, Connie moved to Ann Arbor, Michigan, to be near her brother Philip, who was a professor at the university. She found a job at the Conflict of Resolution Journal as a secretary, then moved on to be an editor. She wrote for the journal, but never wrote any more music. Connie's friends wrote her, but she almost stopped talking to her. Philip stated that she seemed really hurt that she didn't make it. During the 10 years that she worked at the journal, she started growing tired of the routine. Her depression increased over the years, and eventually her co-workers pooled enough money to send her on a sabbatical to London for 8 months. While she came back having enjoyed her time in Europe, it did little to change her demeanor. I've also read that later on in the future, the journal that she worked at was sold or they just moved to Yale, which really hurt her because I guess she really loved her job in some ways. So when ended up leaving Michigan to go all the way to Yale, that supposedly hurt her demeanor even more. Months later, though, after the sabbatical, Connie's mother invited her on a trip to Alaska with a friend. She initially didn't want to go on the trip since she wouldn't be able to smoke or drink around two old women. Connie went anyway, stating, "I want to go to Alaska like I want to go to the basement," as the cab taking her left for the airport. Of course, the trip to Alaska did not help her either. Once they came back, her mother started planning another long trip almost immediately. Her brother Philip thinks that this may have been what put her over the edge, and the idea of having to spend more alone time with her mother was not something she wanted. It was also during this time that Connie found out that she needed a hysterectomy. This piece of news was extremely hard on her, and while she never married or even had children, Philip said that Connie loved kids. It should also be noted that Philip, her brother that she seemed most close to in her family, has stated that he never met a suitor during his time around Connie. He never knew if she was a lesbian, though the thought has crossed his mind. Apparently, Connie was a very private and personal person, and any questions about her personal life would be responded with a very curt yes or no. In the documentary about her, Connie's nephew stated that there isn't any evidence that she even had a romantic relationship. Which, not to derail from the timeline, but I want to go over her song lyrics a little bit. While not having any record of a relationship, her songs from the 50s talked a little bit about love and people that she seemed to know. Her arguably most popular song, "Talkin' Like You, Two Tall Mountains," has a part that says, "Up that tree, there's a sort of a squirrel thing. Sounds just like we did when we were quarreling. You may think you left me all alone, but I can hear you talk without a telephone. I don't stand in the need of company with everything I see talking like you." Which to me sounds like at one point she may have had something with someone and eventually they broke up. It's possible she wrote that poem about them because she missed them. And in her song "Roving Woman," there's a part that goes, "A lady should never habituate saloons, and that's where I find myself on many afternoons. But just as I begin to blow away the foam, someone tips his hat to me and takes me home." Where it sounds to me a lot like herself, because she really liked to drink, as pretty much every report has ever said about her. The song sounds like she was writing about herself, and she probably knew that in the culture she was raised in, smoking, drinking, and premarital sex were all things that she shouldn't partake of. More than anything, I think that she spent her time in New York not just trying to make it big, but probably trying to find herself too. In 1974, right before her 50th birthday, Connie wrote letters to her family and friends where she applauded the downfall of Richard Nixon, and she's going to head west in her VW Bug. Her brother Philip stated that she was going to leave earlier, but she stopped to watch the news since this was the time where Nixon's scandal was going on. Eventually, Connie did drive away, but she never came back. Before leaving, in her letters, she advised Philip to pay her health insurance with the set amount of money that she left behind up until a certain point. In the letter, it stated that if she still needed to pay after that point, she would let him know, but he never heard from her again. A couple of years after her disappearance, someone that knew Philip said that they found the name Elizabeth Converse in the phone book, though they couldn't remember if the name was from Oklahoma or Kansas. Either way, Philip did not pursue the lead since he felt that leaving was her choice. When I searched the census records for a potential match on this name, I personally did not see anything named, or anyone named Elizabeth Converse, that would have corresponded with Connie. I saw close names for Kansas, but those people seem to have had families, and Connie, of course, never had any children. And by census records, I mean really more like residential records that you could find on like genealogy websites online. About 10 years later from her disappearance, Philip hired a private investigator to try and find his sister, though the investigator told him, Even if he did find her, it was her right to disappear, and he could not simply bring her back. From that point on, Philip and his family respected her wishes to disappear and have contemplated the possibilities that have happened to her ever since. Philip thinks that she may have committed suicide, perhaps by driving her car into the river. Neither her or the car have ever been found. Philip thinks that the possibility is there since in the past, when he was 11 years old, there was a girl who was a friend of his sister's that committed suicide. While everyone else in the community were angry and resented the girl that took her own life, Philip remembers Connie stating that the decision to take one's own life was very personal, and she very much believed, even back then, that if anything should be left up to a person, it was whether or not to live. Ever since her disappearance, not a single soul that knew Connie beforehand ever saw or heard of her again, except one person. On the podcast Spinning on Air, a friend of Connie's appeared, telling a story about how Connie convinced her friend to marry her second husband, who she divorced 3 months later. The friend stated that after the divorce, Connie called her, saying that she was sorry for ever recommending the man because she was only thinking about how her friend could have been good for him and not how good he could have been for the friend. This friend also stated that she doesn't remember exactly when the call took place, though she thought it was about 1975 or 1976. Though of course if we knew when this marriage ended and started, that would probably help a lot more too. Overall, anyone that knew Connie in her New York or Michigan life ever saw her ever again. And that brings up the question, where does she go? If we think about her letters and what happened to her, I think we can say that she stayed in the United States until at least her insurance ran out. There are plenty of people that know about this case online, and some think that she potentially took a plane to Europe after she sent her family the letters. Though in my opinion, why would she tell her brother to pay her insurance if she was just going to bail the country anyway? So in my personal opinion, I think she stayed in the US. Thankfully, Connie, or Elizabeth, has been entered into Name Us, where she could be found online on the database. Here, we can find more details about her that we didn't know before. According to the database, she was rather tall, between 5'7" and 5'10", and weighed anywhere between 140 and 170 pounds. I did some looking, and there's one unidentified body that seems similar to her description on the database, close to the area where she was last seen. On May 6, 1977, a white female was found on the Detroit River, half a mile east of Grassy Island. Her hair was gray to partially gray, had a scar on the right side of her neck that was 3 inches from the ear to the eye. She's listed as 5'6", between the ages of 50 and 65, and 142 pounds. The case number is 773205. While there aren't any pictures of this doe, the Wyandotte doe, as I'm calling her, has features that seem similar to Connie's. Even further, this doe was located not far from Ann Arbor, which is a close drive to Detroit. Alternatively, there are people who think that Connie could be another doe, that some call the Fairfax or Annandale doe. This doe was found in Fairfax, Virginia on December 18, 1996. This doe was between 50 to 70 years old, weighed 157 pounds, had curly auburn hair, and had an 8-inch scar on her stomach, which is stated as potentially being from a C-section. According to doenetwork.org, Fairfax doe was found under these circumstances. A groundskeeper at the Pleasant Valley Memorial Park Cemetery discovered the decedent's body near the section of the cemetery where infants are buried, but not near any particular grave. There was a clear plastic sheet on the ground with an 8-inch Christmas tree adorned with gold balls and red ribbons. She had a portable tape player with headphones which were on her ears. A recording of comedians Mel Brooks and Carl Reiner doing their 2,000-year-old man routine was in the player. She had committed suicide by drinking brandy and had a .14 blood alcohol level, swallowing Valium and placing a plastic bag over her head and tying it off with tape, suffocating herself. She left two $50 bills, one for the coroner and one for the cemetery, both with the same typed note. Deceased by own hand. Prefer no autopsy. Please order cremation with funds provided. Thank you, Jane Doe. She had no receipts in her pockets for investigators to trace her movements. Most of the headstones nearby where she was found were fairly recent. The site would probably not be known to a drifter. Fairfax Doe's number is N 1996-41257. While Fairfax Doe may not add up in height, there are many who still believe in her being a possibility, since the artist's recreation seems so similar to Connie Converse. What is interesting to me is that this Doe left behind a note stating no autopsy and a poem. Even further, there are dentals and fingerprints of this Doe, yet 23 years later there haven't been any clues as to who she is. What's interesting to me is how this Doe was found, infants were buried, and it was stated in the past that Connie loved children. As a final point, years later in 2004, Gene Deitch appeared on NPR radio playing a few tracks of Connie's, which people loved. Eventually, an album was released in 2009 with the tracks that she recorded under him, and people have been listening to her ever since. What I find interesting about this is that at this point her music was finally out to the world. In my opinion, if she were still alive, I think that she would have come forward once Gene played her music for all the world to see. With the invention of the internet, she has a following of people all over. In other words, I think that by the time Gene played her music online, she may have already been dead. Perhaps in some way, Gene played her music so that she could come forward if she was still around. At the time, she would have been 85. But even 10 years later from the album being out, no one has ever heard from her. So it almost feels safe to say that she might not be with us anymore.